Hello YouTube, and thank you for stopping by Vector Space. My name is Mike. I'm a member of Vector Space in Lynchburg, Virginia. And this evening I thought I would just go over some of the design elements of a piece that I built yesterday. Probably about 5 or 6 hours total time. And explain some of the design elements of what you're probably wondering is, what on earth is that thing? Some sort of Pez dispenser. It's something I could have lived without forever, been just fine. But I had this scrap walnut, and I've got a whole lot of this scrap that I just wanted to find something useful to do with it. And some of the grain is really unique, so I thought I would make something out of it. So this, which I'll describe in just a moment, started with a board just like this, but a few inches longer. This just happened to be a shorter cutoff. Some of the same rot that you see here is actually still evident in the piece here. It kind of survived the all the work and tooling, which is fine. To me, that kind of gives some character to the piece. But I resawed it, so I started with what's called 8/4. So it's 2 inches thick. And on a bandsaw, I cut it down into pieces that are roughly 1/4 inch thick. And I actually left that rough edge on the inside, which you'll see in a moment. I did that to get as much material as I could out of these boards. And also just because I didn't need a thick piece to do what this thing does. And what it does, to finally answer the question, is it is a dispenser for vitamin packets. I know what on earth would lead somebody to build such a thing, but I can pull my little vitamin packets out, and it keeps me from having empty boxes or cardboard boxes on the counter. It looks a little bit nicer than the cardboard box that they come in. And so that was a project I just dreamt up in just a few minutes as I was staring at some of this otherwise scrap would have just been thrown away or burned. And sometimes it's nice just to come up with a small project that you can build in a short period of time, and it then becomes part of your life. So I thought I'd go over some of the design elements of this, show you that very simple in design, but it's the way it goes together from a joinery standpoint, from a material selection standpoint, there's a good bit of thought in it. You can see that this cherry actually stands proud of the walnut here. And so I just edge glued that. There's no joinery built into that. That's long grain to long grain, so it's plenty strong. It has all the structural integrity it needs. And these are just butt joints, also long grain to long grain glue, and no special fasteners or anything needed there. So there's no metal in any of this. It's all just held together by glue. The base, also the same scrap walnut and some scrap cherry that I had laying around. I don't think this was the exact board I cut it off of, but that's another piece of cherry, and you can see some of the sapwood and stuff. This is stuff that often gets hard to incorporate into other pieces because a lot of people don't want the variation between the sap and the dark and the light colored wood. But just edge join this stuff together to make a heavy base so that it wouldn't tip over. And this is some of the leftover of that edge joining. So again, cherry and walnut together, nice contrast. On the back side, I extended the cherry. It's the same piece of cherry that comes out of the back that you see in the front here. Extended that to create a little foot so that it was a little bit more stable, and also just to kind of visually balance it so there was a feature on the back side of it. A lot of this was just kind of playing with detail. And back to some of the details in the lid, you can see I didn't need to create a lip underneath the lid. You can still see the bandsaw resaw marks on that. I didn't need to create a lid because it was captured here. And so to make these real fine cuts, I often use something like this Japanese pole saw. This is a very, very thin kerf, very thin. So you can get very precise cuts. And then I'll use little rat tail files, things that are just designed to get into tight spaces, little contours, and that's how I'll often work the corners. I don't know if I can get that to focus or not. But those are just inexpensive tools. Vector Space has them, and they're great to work with. If you look really carefully, you'll see that there's a real slight radius on all the edges here. And that's something that I find adds a warmth to a piece, kind of an organic feel. When you have a lot of sharp lines, it certainly looks precise. But even down here, where you've got some profiling on the edges, all of these corners are eased. And I've built furniture and done a lot of woodwork over the years, and I used to really shoot for hard, sharp angles, and somehow that appealed to me. But I find now that pieces look more polished and more natural somehow when they've got just easier edges. Also here you can see where it's raised, maybe 3/16 or no, not quite that much, maybe 1/8 of an inch. It stands off of the walnut. So another thing that I think is worth talking about in a piece like this is just the grain selection itself. And you can just barely make out here that you've got this kind of arched cathedral sort of profile. Now this is unfinished. This is still just raw wood. I've only taken it, I think, to about 120 grit. And I'll only go to probably 180 for this. But on this side, it's the same thing. And so these two pieces of wood are a mirror image. And you can achieve that by, when you resaw the large board, for instance, this is going through the bandsaw, and you're taking slices like this off it. And so when each slice comes off, if you take the other one this way, you create a mirror image of that grain. And so once this is finished, that grain will really be a lot more pronounced, and it'll create kind of a neat visual effect. And so as you're beginning to lay a piece out and select a piece of wood for one part versus another, it's helpful to think about what will the finished pieces look like once they're put together. So the last thing I'll talk about are some of the tools that I used. This is a scribe I use for finding the center point. So you can see here that I can drag it along this way, and there's a little nib that makes a scratch. And if I want to find the center point, then I can just reverse it and run it, and then I've got two lines to compare. And so naturally you would, with only one hand, I'm holding the camera, you would adjust this, change the depth. This is a marking gauge. I made this one out of literally scrap. This was some extruded aluminum that was in around the shop, and this was a rod that came off of some sort of camper or something. But anyway, I probably made this 20 years ago. You can buy these. Vector Space Shop has one. It doesn't look like this, but it has the same function. It's just a way of marking and scribing. And I point that out because there's not a measuring tape on here. The only thing I used to measure any part of this was the packet itself. That determined the dimensions. And I stacked a bunch of packets up to figure out how many a month would take to fill that space. And then, in case they want to stand upright, I made a little block that slides down on top of them to keep them all flat. But through all that process, there were no numbers. There was no measuring. It was just using the packet as a guide and then transferring marks with straight edges and squares. And that was really it. This is just a Japanese square. Nothing really special about that. It's very similar to kind of of a standard machinist square that you'd see here. And then to get really good joints like this, before I glue them up, I'll usually stand the pieces edgewise, as if I was going to join these two boards like this, I'd put them in a vise and use a scraper to make them both perfectly flat. That helps get all the machining marks, which actually you can see the saw marks here. So then the last, well, actually, Forstner bit, still got some of the cherry in there. That's what I use to get a perfectly round cutout for that. So some simple tools, not a lot of stuff. Obviously, I did dimension the wood on a joiner and a planer and a table saw, all of which Vector Space has. And this is a real simple piece, and is, like I said, not something I needed to have in my life, but I had this beautiful wood that I wanted to put to use. And so kind of on a whim, I decided to build this thing. And I kind of rushed the glue times with a fan. So I probably didn't have anything in clamps longer than maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. But this is a good example of a small project that if you're just wanting to get into woodworking, or you're already a woodworker and kind of want to focus on new techniques, maybe you could stop by Vector Space. Become a member. If you're not in Lynchburg, Virginia, then there's other maker spaces out there where people are congregating and sharing knowledge. And there's always someone there that's interested in whatever your hobby is. If it's not woodworking, if it's metalworking, if it's sewing, if it's leatherwork, 3D printing. There's so many different things to do there. And what I've shown you tonight is just kind of the thoughts and ramblings of one guy that happens to enjoy building things, and certainly a member of Vector Space. And if you're not familiar with it, check it out. I'm sure there's a link down there below the video. And thanks so much for watching. Have a nice night.